Chapter 3: The Sword and the Stone. The pencil, along with Mr. Torrance's bottom, began to wiggle as he reached around for the last couple of books. David, along with the rest of the class, began to brace himself for the explosion of anger that was bound to come the moment he found that foreign body poking out of his backside. There was no way that the girl was going to admit what she had done, nor would anyone else grass her up. Most people stopped the telltale phase the moment they hit secondary school. With no confession coming from the culprit, there would only be one outcome: a collective punishment. Certainly, Mr. Torrance was known to go down that route. David was told about a time at the beginning of term when somebody had ripped a page on one of the class novels. Since nobody was owning up to it, Mr. Torrance forced the entire class to copy the contents of the ripped page, both sides, in their neatest handwriting. If even the smallest error was discovered, they were forced to start again from the beginning. That was what happens when a book got damaged. David could only imagine what would happen after an incident such as this. Perhaps he was thinking about possible punishments that made David do what he did next. Before he could properly think about what he was doing, David found himself standing up and taking steps towards his teacher. Chris put an arm out to try and stop him going any further, but David brushed it aside. He knew what he had to do. David was aware that he would almost certainly be caught, and any punishment that followed would be his to shoulder alone. But this was no time for cowards. He summoned all the bravery he could muster and approached Mr. Torrance, ready to remove the pencil from its rancid resting place. David thought briefly about a story his mum had told him when he was younger: the legend of the sword and the stone. In this story, a poor orphaned boy called Arthur becomes a hero when, against all odds, he achieves the impossible task of pulling Excalibur from its bed of solid rock. Arthur becomes famous, adored by the people, and is crowned the King of England. This was David's sword and the stone moment. He imagined himself as Arthur. This was his chance to become a legend in his own right. David steadied his hand, ready to pull Excalibur with all his might. What happened next happened so quickly, it was unlikely that anybody other than David was fully able to process the sequence of events. Between his thumb and his forefinger, David gripped the pencil and, quick as a flash, yanked it out from between the cheeks of his teacher's bottom and hid it behind his back. At exactly the same moment, Mr. Torrance began to rise, books piled up to his chin, and turned to face David. He had been caught. The teacher glared down at the pupil who stood in front of him. "Tell me why," snarled Mr. Torrance at David. "You see it as acceptable to wander from your seat without permission." David could barely hide his relief. Mr. Torrance hadn't felt the pencil at all. He had happened to be finished with the books at the same moment David had finished pulling it out. He refused to allow himself to think about what would have happened had it been a fraction of a second slower. I'm sorry, sir. I dropped my pencil," David replied, showing it to Mr. Torrance before making his way back to his throne. "Well, you may have free rein to stroll around the class willy-nilly in your last school," the teacher replied. "But in this school, you sit." Before he reached his desk, David saw the beaming smiles the rest of the class were giving him. Even Becky had managed to summon a small grin. There was one person, though, who was not sharing in the spirit of joy and relief. David's eyes met the unforgiving, deathly stare of the girl who had thrown the pencil. He gulped before turning away and sitting back down. And that's the end of chapter 3. Short chapter. I'll be back soon with chapter 4.